Welcome to the King of Games 98! On this episode, it's the semi-finals! Welcome back, you punks, hustlers, and maniacs, to another special episode of the King of Games 98, as we enter the moment of truth that is the semi-final portion of our tournament. My name is Ozzy Garcia, and I will be your host for this fine episode. And for those of you that have not been listening to the series, the King of Games 98 is a special project in which we consider 16 of the best games that came out in 1998, which is generally recognized as one of the best years in gaming, and then we make them fight against each other in a mano-a-mano matchup to see which one prevails. And so now we have traversed the round of 16 and then the round of 8, and we have also listened to our honorable mentions that did not quite make the cut. So that means we are now down to 4 games, 2 of which will advance to the finals, and 1 of which will ultimately be crowned the King of Games 98. Today we have for you the 2 semifinal matchups rolled up into 1 episode, so you won't have to hold your breath for long unless you're in the New York City subway, but that's an entirely different story.
Is it the P, Ozzy? Is it the P?
That's a deep cut, man.
So the 2 matchups in the semifinals are actually Gran Turismo going up against Half-Life, and then we have Metal Gear Solid going up against The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So interesting matchup. You would have thought that one semifinal matchup would have been the finals, but the way that the bracket worked out, you have Metal Gear Solid and Ocarina of Time going up in the semifinals.
My goodness.
That's just the way it goes. So this is going to be a big one, guys. This is going to be a big bang. And for this particular portion of the tournament, we have a full house of 5. As I am joined by Paul Ramallo in Canada. Say hello, Paul.
Hello, Paul.
There you go. He follows orders. That's a very good thing. We also have Ronaldo Perez in Rhode Island, as he goes by Arnie. What's up, Arnie?
Not much. Looking forward to this.
And we also have Anthony Oriaga in the Bronx, Briax.
And I just want to thank myself for looking presentable, like I can go out in public again.
He's like a new man, I swear.
He's like the
how
only
good
one here
looking
that's
he is.
presentable.
You guys all lost faith in me, man.
If we had a video feed,
I was really feeling bad for your fiance for a while now. I was like, man, how the hell did he end up with her? Now I know.
Yeah. If we had a video feed, we would all be very concerned about our respective others. Because Anthony would just be, making everyone swoon left and right. And rounding out the 5, we also have Jeff Ivats in the Netherlands. So what's up, Jeff?
Hey, what's up? I am super nervous about this one. I'm going to make some enemies here.
Okay, my palms are sweaty already, man. I'm holding onto the phone, looking at the outline, and it's sliding out of my hand. I'm like, oh no.
We'll be fine. We are titanium. We are impervious here to criticism. But with the entire crew participating, we actually want to foreclose criticism, even though that's not going to happen. We're still going to be criticized. But with 5 of us, there's no way anyone can argue that we did not give these games their fair shake. And more importantly, there's no way that Arnie can screw it up. So that's ultimately the goal of this whole thing.
Oh, I shouldn't be laughing so hard. Sorry, buddy.
But before we get further into this episode, I would like to mention that if you do like what you hear with this episode, and if you dig these frivolous projects from the region-free gamers, make sure to let us know by leaving us a review on iTunes or any other podcast of choice, and also by sending us a very good, crunchy uppercut to the subscribe button. More importantly, make sure to let others know about our little podcast if you think they will like what we are doing, because the farther we reach ears and listeners, the more we can expand and bring you more content. Mm-hmm. So, as we are now in the semifinals, we're going to treat the matchups a little bit differently. Traditionally, we have had 4 different criteria in order to judge the contenders, and that included our personal experience, sales and critical reception, legacy, and whether it was genre defining, and lastly, which one of these would we ultimately prefer to play in a head-to-head matchup. But since we have already gone through a bunch of these games numerous times now, we don't feel like we need to go over that, and we are now a little bit more consolidated in our criteria. So We have talked about our experiences. My co-panelists, for the most part, have spoken about all of them. There are a few games that we have not talked about in terms of one of our co-panelists or another. So we'll ask them in that case. But the way that we will tackle this is that we will go through the particular innovations and genre-defining aspects of each particular game and see how they stack up against each other. So it's like a ball, like a black hole of like awesomeness. Since these games are so great, we're just going to see, which one is greater than the other based on their respective titanic power. I don't know where I'm going with this, but ultimately what I'm trying to say is that the main metrics are what game has stood the test of time best and which of them has left the largest imprint on the industry. So this portion is almost like an amalgamation of the head-to-head and legacy criteria of the prior rounds, which means that the judging is more subjective, but then again, that's been the case all along.
Yeah.
So, unless anybody else has anything else to say, why don't we get started with our first matchup, which is Gran Turismo versus Half-Life.
Let's get in there.
Let's go.
All right. So, Gran Turismo, Half-Life. So, let's go a little bit over how each game got to this point. So, in the case of Gran Turismo, it first went up against the beloved RPG cult classic that was Xenogears. And if you guys remember, Gran Turismo met with a very fierce defense by Kelly of Xenogears. But ultimately, it was unavailing because Arnie and myself voted to let Gran Turismo advance. And then in the second round, Gran Turismo pulled the surprising upset that left many Pokemaniacs very sad and raging. So Gran Turismo, by unanimous vote of Anthony, Jeff, and myself, took down the uber popular pocket monsters of Nintendo that were introduced in Pokemon Red and Blue. So
a unanimous vote of adults.
Yes.
I mean, it's the only correct choice. And there go all our listeners. In the case of Half-Life, it's interesting because the very first matchup that it had was one of the most comparable matchups of the entire series, because it actually went up against Unreal, which was another first-person shooter on the PC that pushed, graphics acceleration and emphasized a little bit more storyline than had come before it. So ultimately, Unreal, and its graphical prowess at the time was no match for Gordon Freeman and his crowbar antics. So Half-Life ultimately crowbarred Unreal to death. We're still reeling from that. It was very gruesome, actually. It was almost like that scene in The Walking Dead where they kill Glenn, and you can see his eyeball popping out. That's exactly how Unreal looked.
I know, right?
At the end of it. Yeah, we didn't expect it to be that grisly, unfortunately, but it ultimately was. So, poor Unreal. But then Half-Life faced Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is the mythical RPG from Sega.
That no one's played.
Andromeda. Yeah, R.I.P., rest in peace. And it was, a 2-1 vote. Ultimately, Half-Life took down Panzer Dragoon Saga because, of course, Arnie was the sole dissenter. As usual.
Incorrect. Incorrect. Factually incorrect.
Yes, incorrect.
Anthony was the sole dissenter.
It was actually me.
It was actually you. God.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't even know what I'm talking about. There you go.
But we'll believe anything now when it comes to Arnie. Like, you should say Arnie.
Yeah, exactly.
I could have said that, and no one would have flinched. No one would have flinched. But
That is, I'm gonna tee you up on that one. That is one technical, sir. If you pick up another, you are ejected.
No, that's a flagrant red card, man. I mean, I should probably fire myself.
I didn't think you believed me when I said it was Arnie.
Yeah. Well, no. So Anthony was the sole dissenter.
It was me.
So there you go. But it still took down Panzer Dragoon Saga. So let's pour one out for Panzer Dragoon Saga. It's had a very battered history, Panzer Dragoon Saga. It's almost like, you feel bad for it. It's like, why would we pile on top of it? This is all it ever wanted, and we took it away from it.
No, we gave it its due. We talked about it for. Dude, we devoted like 2 hours to a game that almost nobody's played.
Much more than
I think it's all right.
Yeah. I guess you're right, Paul. I guess you're right.
Paul. Yeah.
But now Gran Turismo goes up against Half-Life, and let's just go a little bit over Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo was developed by Polyphony Digital. It was produced by Kazunori Yamauchi, which he's now synonymous with the name Gran Turismo. It required 5 years to complete and was an absolutely gargantuan game. on the PlayStation. So it was released on May 12th, 1998 in North America, even though it was released in Japan at the end of the year of 1997 before that. It has a Metacritic of 96 and lifetime sales of 10.85 million copies, which makes it the best-selling PS1 game of all time. So certainly no slouch. And that's something that you're gonna, be able to notice on this particular semifinal matchup. All the games that are here right now are the very top echelon of gaming. These are some of the absolute best. But I want to ask you, Paul. You are the only one, I think, on the episode that has not gotten the opportunity to talk about your personal experience with Gran Turismo. So tell us a little bit more about your experience with the game.
Well, with Gran Turismo, it was like a bomb just dropped, right? Like, my friends and I had heard about it back when, it was just released in Japan, and we were, we all had, like, modified PlayStations, right? We were able to play Japanese games and so on. That was kind of the thing at the time. And as soon as Gran Turismo got released and we were able to get our hands on the Japanese version, we jumped. Because there's just kind of no need for English in that game, really, right?
No.
Like, it helps, but it's not a big deal. And so, yeah, we picked it up pretty much immediately, and we were all immediately engrossed. We poured dozens and dozens of hours into that game. I'd go over to my friends' places, see what they did with their cars, they'd see what I did with mine. The amount of tuning that was available, oh my God, like, just thinking about those first few moments with it was absolutely mind-blowing. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that it just, at least for me, it automatically obsoleted pretty much every racing game I had played to that point. It was unbelievable. Also, by the way, looked fantastic.
Yeah, it was an absolute stunner at the time, particularly when you consider that before this game, Polyphony had just done Motortune Grand Prix, which was a kart racer. You couldn't really tell that Polyphony was going to drop the type of bomb that it dropped, with Gran Turismo. Let me ask you, Paul, did you have difficulties adapting to the different style of play that Gran Turismo presented?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, like, the thing is, love it or hate it, the licensing system is there for a reason, right? Like, yeah, you want to move forward through the game, and oh, wow, it's really annoying that you have to get these stupid licenses and pass these tests, but they're there for a reason. They're there to teach you. And so, while there were some driving techniques that, through gaming, not through real life, because none of us drives like that on the street, let's not kid ourselves.
I mean, I do.
Well, yeah, that's true. You are a gangster. But
original gangster. That's my. Those are my initials. There's a reason for that.
for the lame people like me in the north who drive the speed limit and obey all the rules, there were some things that I had learned just through kind of gaming in racing games, like choosing a line and stuff like that. But Gran Turismo really just kind of broke it down, and all the things that I knew were refined, and all the things I didn't know were taught. And they were done in a very comprehensive manner. It was absolutely fantastic. Nothing like it before, as far as like teaching the player how to drive and how to play the game.
Yeah, and Paul said something that I want to ask the rest of the crew about. He said that to him, Gran Turismo obsoleted all the racing games that had come before it. Jeff, let me ask you, I mean, do you really believe that's the case? I mean, is there no space for the different type of arcade experience, the likes of Outrun, the likes of Top Gear, that we saw before this? I mean, did Gran Turismo just supplant those? And can you see them coexisting with each other? Yeah,
well, I mean, I always refer back to the experience I had, and that was with my brother, who was, I think I said on the other episode, was the motorsport nut out of the two of us, out of the pair of us, and it obsoleted every game for him. This was the game, and he stuck with Gran Turismo iteration after iteration until he had kids and he couldn't do it anymore. And I always look at that as a yardstick, because he's not really a gamer, but he absolutely adored it, and he loved the license system as well. And every time we got a new racing game, he'd be okay for 45 minutes, an hour max, but then he'd always go back to Gran Turismo. So I think that going forward, absolutely, until Gran Turismo 2 came out, it kind of like, well, why am I going to play these when I've got something so comprehensive? In terms of like looking back at previous games, for someone like me, I still enjoy the Mario Kart a lot. I still enjoyed like the Ridge Racer and Rage Racer, those series, but they were very unfulfilling. And I could see with Gran Turismo, it gives you a lot of satisfaction. Not only do you win a race, but you also, as Paul was saying, you really feel like you've accomplished something because you've learned something. Whereas Rage Racer or Ridge Racer Revolution, the games that I had, or even Daytona, like they were just like short, arcadey fun experiences after half an hour, highly forgettable. So that's how I kind of stand with how it stands against those kind of games.
Yeah, Arnie, what are your thoughts on that particular point?
I obviously for me it didn't obsolete them. I'm still more of I prefer arcade racers to the more sim-like experiences, but I think what Gran Turismo did was sort of open up that lane and sort of bring in people who maybe weren't interested in the more arcadey type experience and were drawn in by the sort of more technical sim tuning aspect. I think eventually what you get out of that is, something like maybe Need for Speed, where eventually it sort of merged the two a little bit, where it wasn't as simmy as Gran Turismo, but it still had like the real life cars and the customizable aspect to it. So I wouldn't say obsolete, but it definitely sort of broadened the appeal of racing games.
Exactly. I mean, do you share that opinion, Anthony?
No, yeah, I agree. Because when Gran Turismo came out, it definitely just... It was definitely something we hadn't seen before to that level, but at the time we were playing a lot of arcade racing games, like Jeff mentioned, and like Arnie mentioned, it was a lot of Daytona, Ridge Racer. So I felt like, this was definitely something that just trumped everything. But then as everything comes in waves, so I think now we're more in a place where like we like the arcade and we like the sim separate, but I don't think we like it in the same game, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, in my case, I think that it's just kind of like a different DNA strand of the racing genre. It created a deviation in the racing genre, whereas before this, every racing game was kind of in the arcade mold. But this created a deviation that, essentially led to the downfall of the arcade racing genre. But now, we can see that there's still, appetite for arcade racing games. But not only that, you can create a more arcadey game, like Arnie has said, that also presents some of the innovations that Gran Turismo presented, such as the acquisition of cars, the tuning, etc. And of course, we saw that later on with a great bulk of racing games that came out on the PS2 that were more focused on tuning, etc. I'm thinking in particular not only Need for Speed, but also Juiced, Midnight Club, etc. Yep. So I think there's room for an amalgamation of the two. But with that out of the way, let's go on to Half-Life, just to keep it moving. In terms of what we know about Half-Life is that it was developed by Valve, which is a company that was founded by Gabe Newell, who is a former Microsoft employee. It was released in November 1998 for Windows PC. It has a Metacritic of 96 on PC and sold 9.3 million copies. And Half-Life, particularly for a PC game, it was a mega bomb. It was one of those games that as soon as it dropped, it completely changed the gaming landscape. We had talked about our experience with Half-Life, so we don't need to go over that again. But, if, Paul, do you have anything else that you want to say about Half-Life in terms of, its release and what you experienced, at retail, for example, when it released?
Yeah, when I was working at the store, it was really all about Half-Life. It just was, right? Like, StarCraft was a big seller, but nothing generated the kind of excitement that Half-Life did. It was extremely innovative for the time. And, if you just even go beyond, it really depends, like, as far as our choices here are concerned, or at least mine, like, how much weight are we giving to all the stuff that Half-Life kind of ancillarily developed, like Team Fortress and Counter-Strike and all that. It's amazing just how much unexpected reach that game had, even beyond the fact that, it sold to 9 million copies and the storytelling was previously unheard of in that kind of game. It really covered a lot of bases that weren't expected.
Exactly. And it did have a lot of innovations, but I guess that's a good cue to go over into what it did. So in terms of Half-Life, as far as I can tell, its main innovations were the popularization of the kind of scripted, story-heavy first-person shooters that would then follow. Before Half-Life, a lot of the games were in the kind of Doom, closet monster corridor shooters where, you found the key in order to advance. And it was just mainly emphasizing the shooting rather than on the narrative progression itself. And then what Half-Life did was it created a storyline in which immersion was prevalent, and that was the main point. And so we saw its influence in other games like Halo. Medal of Honor was hugely influenced by Half-Life, I think. Kind of like the introduction where you're storming Normandy, kind of pulling you in media res into something that's already happening, and being very heavily scripted. I think Medal of Honor would not have been the way it was had it not been for Half-Life. And then, that eventually led into Call of Duty, which, you can see the DNA strand here, that Medal of Honor was first made by EA, and then some of the EA developers went on to found Infinity Ward, where they created Call of Duty as a competitor to Medal of Honor. And so, they were all influenced by Half-Life. And now, you kind of see the through line of all the Call of Duties, which is the biggest, franchise right now, I would say, in the video game landscape. All of that, kind of is traceable back to Half-Life. I mean, is it fair to say that, Arnie?
I would say so. I think that, like you said, what Half-Life really added, the new dimension to it per se, I think was that sort of integrated world, that sort of very, very much steeped in narrative, that was, the game. Another thing is, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I really like Gordon Freeman just as a main character, especially in a first-person shooter.
Do you like blank slates? I mean, is that really what it is about?
No, I just like the idea of, it's always fun to be Doom Marine guy. It's always fun to be Duke Nukem and BJ Blazkowicz, these muscle-bound, super buff, mega dudes. But somebody like Gordon Freeman, a scientist that's sort of thrown into a situation where, they're not prepared for this at all. This is not what they signed up for when they got up out of bed that morning, is sort of something that I feel a lot more interested in. I want to learn more about how he's going to resolve these problems rather than, whoever ex-Marine, steroid guy is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we all know how Duke Nukem's going to handle it.
Yeah, exactly.
Kick ass and chew bubblegum.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting, Gordon Freeman being one of the first, I think the first-person shooter character that wore glasses. It would have been interesting to have a mission where he loses his glasses.
Well, I think Duke Nukem wore sunglasses, right? So there you go. Maybe they were prescription sunglasses. I don't know. That's not...
Yeah, I forgot he wore sunglasses. Oh my God, Duke Nukem.
They were transitional glasses.
Let me ask Jeff a question. I mean, one of the things, that is most criticized nowadays in kind of the Call of Duty genre is how scripted it all is. And, that's kind of traced back to Half-Life. It really created, a form of environmental storytelling through scripted cutscenes or scripted behavior. Do you ultimately believe, Jeff, that this innovation had kind of a double-edged sword aspect to it, where it actually led to a decline or deterioration in game design philosophy?
Good question, because I
know it's a very loaded question.
Yeah.
It's heavy.
My personal experience with the Call of Duty games and where I see them and where they've gone is that I think that they have become very generic and very by the number, just because they've taken it to a point where you're in a movie that you can't do anything with. A bit like watching Uncharted. Sometimes you feel like, this is all great, but I'd rather be doing it than watching it, because that's what a game is about. So the double-edged sword for me is definitely there. I know a lot of people get kicks out of Medal of Honor and Call of Duty. I think that the beauty, when we covered Half-Life, and I'm kind of thinking back through what were the points that we made to vote for it, and I think just that pure freedom of not only is a story happening around you as a character, but you've got the ultimate freedom of watching it from any location almost within any room that that the game inhabits, that the character inhabits.
Yeah.
And
all in-engine stuff, no pre-rendered cutscenes, that stuff really pulls you in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stepping into the shoes of the character was its main innovation, where you could decide to sit in front of, stand in front of the NPC and listen to him talk, or you could go around and swing your crowbar wildly, like a maniac.
Whereas
so
now you're kind of being forced to watch. Sorry. Now you're being forced to watch like almost like social commentary. It's like, we're going to put you in this room full of certain types of people, and you're going to have to watch them get murdered. It's like, okay, thanks. That's exactly what I would do.
And so Anthony, I mean, let me ask you, because I know that you tend to like the big AAA type titles, with a lot of cinematic flair, etc. Do you see kind of like that detriment to Half-Life's innovation of, introducing scripted, behavior, etc.?
I think at the time when Half-Life was released, it was something that I know, even though I didn't play it when it was released, but it was something I was looking for. It was something I needed in a first person shooter, and it was something that I don't think I can play a first person shooter nowadays without having that storyline and those characters and whatnot. So to me, it did something that I don't think I can live without anymore if I'm playing a first person shooter.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, yes, Half-Life had that scripted component, but as we saw with later games, Valve was not just happy to just stay within that scripted confine. And so with Half-Life 2, they created a lot of mechanics around the story itself so that it was not just about the scripted components. And now we have Half-Life Alyx, which is a VR experience, which ultimately you can kind of see Valve's ultimate goal being to place the players into the shoes of the character, and that involves, the scripted aspect. So, Paul, do you think that it's just that the subsequent influenced developers have just not had the quality, of game design and development that the folks at Valve have had?
Innovating a solution to this particular problem is beyond probably all but maybe a handful of geniuses, in all honesty, right? Because before Half-Life, what you had for narrative was nothing.
Yeah.
And so Half-Life presented a solution, presented it very well, and since then we've just kind of built upon that solution. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It was a solution. We just haven't really developed anything more.
Yeah, I think also the fact that console FPSs have really, really shifted to multiplayer focus has not been great for that particular aspect. I feel like a lot of development studios don't put as much time into their single player experiences.
Yeah.
Because that is not, for the most part, that is not what the majority of people who are buying that game are buying it for.
Yeah.
If you're Infinity Ward, I don't see why you would put, so many resources into a campaign when most people just want to play Warzone.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other part of it, is that what Half-Life introduced has now sort of been made as threadbare as possible because it's not the main draw anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't want to be tough on Infinity Ward and Activision, these guys, but I think it's most in part, it's lazy. I don't think they care about telling a good story anymore. It's like you're a US Marine, Joey Jojo Corp, and there's a country in the middle of the Bekistans who's going at war, and you need to go in, and then it all just kind of unravels in front of you. Oh, some guys, he's gone behind your back. Oh yeah, that's no surprise. He's British, of course he would. Yeah. And it would last for 6 hours. And you'd end up fighting on American soil because the White House is being blown up. And you're like, I'm doing this all over again. I'm doing this again. Meanwhile, everyone's playing multiplayer. And me being the idiot, I'm playing a single player going, this isn't a very good game. And all my mates are going, why are you playing a single player? Are you mental? Get on the multiplayer. Oh, right, sorry. That's how it is now with these games.
Yeah, the philosophy of the FPS, I think, has changed a lot from when Half-Life was initially released to now.
Yeah.
So let me ask, because Paul mentioned Counter-Strike and Team Fortress, how much should we attribute to Half-Life's indirect creation of those games and, in a way, their own particular multiplayer genres? how much value should we attribute to that in weighing whether Half-Life should advance or not? Anthony, let me ask you first.
I think, you can appreciate what they were doing, but I think if we're judging Half-Life by itself, to me, Half-Life on its own merit just was so good. Counter-Strike and Team Fortress, like these bonuses that were given to us, It just felt like you can see the evolution of what they were doing and what they were trying to do, but these were added bonuses to their overall vision, I feel.
Yeah. And by that same token, Paul, let me ask you, should we also attribute any value to the fact that Half-Life indirectly led to the creation of Steam?
I would place more value on Counter-Strike and Team Fortress than Steam necessarily. Mm-hmm. Really what Half-Life does is it gives Valve that kind of financial foundation that they can build more dreams upon. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
As far as Counter-Strike and Team Fortress, I think one thing, Anthony, that you might have missed is how smart Valve was in just kind of embracing that mod community.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Making assets out of Counter-Strike and Team Fortress.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, yeah.
It created an ecosystem, essentially, where where these types of experiences could be created.
Yeah, and Counter-Strike, make no mistake, that game was gigantic. Gigantic. As far as competitive multiplayer went, Counter-Strike was the king for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and that's very fair. And so let me ask, Arnie, what are some of the dated elements of Half-Life that you don't see it standing the test of time very well?
Insofar as I've played, I think my biggest problem with Half-Life is sort of the controls and the platforming specifically. I don't think that has aged very well in its favor. I don't know, having not played it at the time, I don't know that it was even acceptable back then. But especially playing it now, it does not look great, and it does not play great. Aside from that, honestly, there's the always the relevant complaints like the graphics and some of the sound and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think looking at it within the context of when it was released, I struggle to find something that would make me say, like, I could not go back and play this ever again. I think what's there is solid, and if you sort of put a little bit of time to get used to, some of these controls and mechanics that aren't necessarily as prevalent now, I think you could have a really good time with it.
Yeah, is there anyone that wants to add anything that they would see as negatives, or dated elements from Half-Life?
Aside from that platforming, nah, I can't really think of anything else. Like, the stuff, like Arnie said, as far as graphics and stuff like that, we can say that about every single game in the semifinals. Gameplay elements are really what kind of differentiates rather than presentation. And for Half-Life, it's really just the platforming.
Yep.
But even that's not like a huge thing.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of a testament to Half-Life's endurance that it's a game that keeps getting remade in new graphics engines, every few years or so. So the foundation of the game itself is so tight that it can bear out in a new engine. I do know, having done research, that there were some that criticized the platforming elements at the time. Yeah. And also the graphics compared to its peers, let's say Unreal or some of the other games that came out around that time, were not quite as impressive, but they were still good. They were still quality. And now, 22 years later, the graphics are not something that we necessarily fault because it's kind of baked into going to an older game. Yeah. So it doesn't bother you as much. But let's move back to Gran Turismo, because its innovations were kind of similar to Half-Life, because it essentially created the car simulation genre. And we've already talked about that, so we don't have to put too much of an emphasis on that. But essentially, it emphasized realism. And that's not something that we saw in games before that. But it also introduced RPG mechanics, to the driving genre, which, you could accumulate cars, you would, acquire experience points. In this case, they would be credits in order to be able to purchase new cars. And it also indirectly led to the decline of the arcade racer. But it also created this kind of synergy with the automotive industry, whereas it kind of crossed over beyond games, and it became so popular that the driving and automotive industry became influenced by the very, innovations and the popularity of Gran Turismo. So eventually we saw that even, Gran Turismo players were eventually able to become professional race car drivers through the Gran Turismo Academy. So, Jeff, let me ask you, how do these innovations of Gran Turismo stack up against Half-Life? The fact that it essentially created a new genre, I mean, how do you stack that against, what Half-Life has done?
No, that's a really good question. When I think about what the impact that Gran Turismo as a franchise now, I mean, we can look back at the whole legacy of what Gran Turismo has become. And I think the one thing that Gran Turismo has done above the Half-Life franchise is it's reached beyond gaming. Gran Turismo, like you say, it's you got this point where, and I know I'm a bit of a PlayStation fanboy from that era, but the PlayStation was really a console and a system embraced by more than just your typical gamer at the time. And it was embraced by many sectors of society and of everything around us. And the motorsport or the car industry were also able to see, I think Gran Turismo opened people's eyes to say, you know what, actually, not only can we put your cars in this, we can get young gamers addicted to your cars, and they'll want to buy them when they're older in life, and they'll become brand loyal to you. And that's something that I think has Gran Turismo really pushed forward. Obviously now, like you were saying, like Need for Speed and all these, they've got all the licenses. You've got all the right Mitsubishis, all the Skylines, all the Nissans, all the Mercedes. It's all there now. Okay, I can't afford a Mercedes right now, or a McLaren, but you know what? That's my aspiration. And like my nephew, he's 12 years old. He's playing Gran Turismo with his dad, and he's getting into that world of loving cars. And I think that's something that is not only are you creating potential car drivers, and we've seen because of this whole lockdown, right? There's been the whole esports with racing drivers, and a lot of esports drivers are beating real life drivers. Well, yeah, of course they will, because they don't know what it feels like to drive with G-force. it's a bit of a different thing, but it really crosses boundaries between the real life and the gaming life, and I think that's something that Half-Life. It's still just a game, and they're games. And like, if I was to give the controller to my wife and go, here's a racing game, she'll understand the principles of what you do with a racing game. I give her a keyboard and a mouse and say play Half-Life 2. She's going to go, well, where am I going? What am I doing? What the hell's going on? So I think that to me is where Gran Turismo kind of lifts gaming out of what we considered gaming, and PlayStation, Polyphony, they were two spearheads for that. There's my pitch.
Oh man, that's a good point. God damn it!
It's a very good pitch. It's a very good pitch. But let me ask Arnie, do you think that Gran Turismo should be faulted in any way for the fact that later iterations have done, the concept a lot better and have improved it and executed in much enhanced ways? Even Gran Turismo 2, just added so much stuff to it. So in a sense, the original Gran Turismo is not original anymore, because you can get a better experience nowadays. And that's a point that came up with Kelly. So should it be faulted for that? Whereas right now with Half-Life, there's no way that you can get that experience anywhere else. You still have to go through that game in order to get that experience.
Yeah, to get that particular story. Absolutely. In terms of it being faulted, I mean, I would be very disappointed if Gran Turismo 1 was still the best Gran Turismo 6 games into the series. But I think ultimately any fault you can find in that has to be counterbalanced by the fact that with Gran Turismo 1, you're building something out of nothing, right? And when you're doing something like that, you are taking the biggest risk. That's not to say that Half-Life didn't take risks and Half-Life didn't innovate, but I think there was more of a foundation for what Half-Life was doing than for what Gran Turismo was doing. And for Sony and Polyphony to sort of spend, 5 years making this passion project happen with no sort of guarantee that something like this would even be noticeable to the gaming public, or even that it would take off the way it did, I think says a lot more about the sort of impetus behind the original Gran Turismo and why it is so great.
Paul, do you want to counter that in any way?
No.
Okay.
Arnie made a good point.
All right, so I think with that, I think we can make a decision, guys.
Yeah.
So let's go around the horn and decide which of these games had the greatest and longest lasting impact on the industry, so that it deserves, to proceed. Which one of them has stood best the test of time, and which one of them has been, most enduring in terms of innovation and its impact on the video game scene. So I'm going to start with you, Anthony.
Oh, thank God.
I knew it. I was trying not to make eye contact on this video. Like, don't look at me, man.
When you're at school, you're like, don't look at the teacher, don't look at the teacher.
That was it.
We practice the Socratic method here at the Region Free Gamers podcast.
Oh man. Anyway, man. Both these games, we wouldn't have so many other games without either one of them. So they're both winners in my book.
Yeah.
Don't cop out. Make a decision, damn it.
No, man. One of them sucks. It needs to go home. Tell us which one.
All right. And a point that was made earlier, because of that point that was made earlier, I'm going to go with Half-Life.
Ooh. Okay, wait, which point was that?
Oh, no, I'm going to get into that, man. It was like, well, first of all...
voice is cracking on everything.
I know, man. No, like, I find that maybe Gran Turismo, the original, might be more playable nowadays, and this was kind of what I would base my previous decisions on. But I think looking back at both these games, I see that the vision that Half-Life created come to complete fruition with their latest release. I just feel like, wow, this is an experience you have to experience with the first game in order to really get the entire story.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. All right, so Paul.
I was going to go Half-Life, and then Jeff made that point about how Gran Turismo kind of lifted the industry and brought it into the hands of people who wouldn't ordinarily play video games. And I'm still going with Half-Life, in spite of that great point.
Yeah. No, I always convince myself.
That almost.
Yeah.
You know what? The fact of the matter is, GT, for as superlative as it is, and the fact that it essentially, I almost want to say created a new genre. I mean, the genre where you drive a car is really the genre, but it really just created its own kind of thing. And that's a big deal. And Half-Life didn't quite do that to the same extent. But the truth of the matter is, the most popular game today is probably the FPS. And it's been like that for a very, very long time. And when you're looking at the impact on the video game industry as a whole, Gran Turismo, it serves a very relatively small subgenre of hardcore fans, whereas Half-Life just really influenced the entire gamut of games. So as far as which one I'd rather play today, it's a toss-up. I could play either one of them today and be perfectly happy. But, Half-Life's the one, man.
All right, that's a very good defense. So Arnie, in the spirit of you being the third one, as always, it's your turn.
This is real weird for me. I like Paul was sort of Half-Life coming in, and there's been a lot of arguments made both ways. I think ultimately what I like about each of these games is, like Anthony said, I think Half-Life has sort of, you can see that progression, and you see sort of the evolution of this story that Valve has been trying to tell for what seems like millennia at this point. I don't know if we'll ever see the end of that story, but it's definitely been a ride that's been worth taking. And with Gran Turismo, I don't think there's a game in this bracket that I have grown to appreciate more from where I was at the beginning to where I am now. Just everything that it did, everything that the creator had to go through to make it a reality, and obviously everything that is accomplished both inside and outside of gaming. I think ultimately Jeff did convince me, and I think I am going to go Gran Turismo on this one.
Boy.
Jesus.
But it's a good point, though, man.
It is.
I remember when we first got Gran Turismo, Gran Turismo, more than any other game I had ever played, made video games cool.
Yeah.
It really did. Like all the real cars and the real tuning, it just felt really. I felt like less of a nerd playing it, even though in reality I wasn't.
Yeah.
More so, actually.
So we're now sitting at 2-1 with Anthony voting Half-Life, Paul voting Half-Life despite waffling a little bit, and Arnie being in character and voting Gran Turismo.
Well done,
so,
Arnie.
Jeff, it's on you now.
Yeah. So for me, two games that I think the points we've all made, it's clear that these are two highly influential games. It's interesting, the two brackets, because I think the other bracket has also got a lot of similarities with each other, just like these two do. And this is where I'm weighing up the real, like I said, like the point that you guys referenced, the point of the real world implications that one has had versus the impact on an industry that the other has had. I have so much respect for the way that they made those cars feel believable, because that's something that no developer had ever done before. Lots of developers had made FPSs before. They were making them since Doom. You know, this was not something completely new, but building up how each car would feel different. And this is where I'm like relying on other people's experience, because I was never good enough for that game. But I can appreciate just like the love that the developers and the programmers had for cars and for driving. And as a subgenre, I think it is an amazing example of how video games transcend the medium that they're in. That professional kind of journalistic opinion put to one side, Half-Life is just so much more fun, and I bloody loved it, and I'm picking Half-Life.
All right.
Okay, good. I thought your brother was hiding in the room there somewhere.
Was he? Oh, geez.
I love how Jeff almost convinced us to vote for Gran Turismo and then was just going to do this.
Right. So
No, but
that means that Half-Life advances because it's now 3-1, but I'm not going to cop out and back out of giving my opinion, because I've never been accused of not being opinionated. So the way see, this is the way I see it. I'm a big film buff. You know, as much as I love games, I also love cinema as much. And the way I see it, to me, Half-Life and Gran Turismo are kind of like choosing between Night of the Living Dead and Blade Runner. In the case of one, it created an entire genre, and there was nothing like it, before it. And you have to appreciate it for that. In the case of the other, it just created a form of narrative storytelling that was not seen before, and it showed that cinema could be much more than it was before. And I think that's what Half-Life did. I think Half-Life really showed that games could do much more than just be shooty, bang, bang. Mm-hmm. And Gran Turismo created a genre. But then again, if I was to go back to Night of the Living Dead, I could see that it was certainly innovative and it created a new genre. But personally, I would prefer a more modern iteration of the genre itself. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I feel about Gran Turismo, that it did something very special in creating this genre. But still, there's so much more out there that has come afterwards that has done, it, better in a way. And you can't fault the fact that Gran Turismo has had such an intense effect outside of gaming. But then again, we're a gaming podcast, and ultimately the medium itself and its impact on the medium should be what prevails most of all. And so I think in that sense, Half-Life has created such an imprint on the gaming landscape that you can't find anywhere else. There's no other Half-Life. It's still, a very special experience, whereas with Gran Turismo, you can get that experience elsewhere. So I would say that means I'm voting Half-Life. So Half-Life advances 4-1 to the next round.
Well
Any
done.
final words to say goodbye to Gran Turismo, Arnie, since you were the one that voted for it?
As a game that I honestly did not think was going to make it out of the round of 16, to have made it all the way to the semifinals, I'm being
And
honest.
it took down Pokemon. Come on, that has...
It ran it over.
Definitely the dark horse that made it the farthest, I think. And I'm happy to see it go. I think it did what it needed to do, and it made it as far as it could have.
Awesome. Anyone else?
Gran Turismo has a ceiling, man. You can't make cars feel more and more realistic. You can make them feel as realistic as they are. And then what are you going to do?
You can get photorealistic leather and have a leather fetish, essentially. That's the logical next step.
You can adjust the suspension in the back seat for when you take your girlfriend back there.
Whoa.
So that's all the Gran Turismo's missing. It would have advanced if it had a co-driver lady, like Outrun, saying, hey!
Oh, yeah, there you go.
That's what it needed to advance. Fortunately, it didn't have that, so it couldn't quite make it. But, that's it. Half-Life. See you in the next round. And with that, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with the second semifinal matchup. Alright everybody, and we're back, and with that nail-biter out of the way, we said goodbye to Gran Turismo, and now we have the Juggernaut. I think if we go back to the very beginning of this episode, we always thought that the final would be Ocarina of Time against Metal Gear Solid. Those were really the heavyweight contenders. And we never cared to look at the actual bracket and realize, oh, they may actually go against each other in the semifinals. So now we kind of have like the mega bomb, atomic bomb that is the matchup between Metal Gear Solid and Ocarina of Time going up in this semifinal matchup. So this is going to be a big one. I actually don't know how we're going to vote on this. So we all don't know how each one of us is deciding. So we're just,
I'm sure the listeners think they know how we're going to vote on this.
Oh, absolutely. I think the listeners think that this is all rigged.
Arnie's going to vote for Banjo-Kazooie.
I think that the listeners probably think that we did this whole thing in order to put Metal Gear Solid up on a pedestal. So we're nothing if not inconsistent. So we're going to make sure to prove them wrong. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Ocarina of Time a little bit and where it got, how it got to this point. So Ocarina started out in one of the more intriguing matchups in the round of 16 as it went up against Resident Evil 2. Unfortunately, Resident Evil 2, despite being a hugely influential game and probably the best game in that franchise, maybe right up there with Resident Evil 4, it really wasn't able to take down Ocarina of Time. It was just too much of a juggernaut to take down. And so with that, Ocarina of Time went up in the round of 8 against Baldur's Gate, and it took it down. Ocarina of Time took down Baldur's Gate by unanimous vote of Paul, Arnie, and myself. I specifically told Arnie that he couldn't fuck it up. And so he, gracefully obliged to not fuck it up.
Funnily enough, listening back to that episode, like when you say like Ocarina won unanimously, that sounds like really sweeping, but I thought it felt closer to me when we were recording it than the vote
absolutely,
indicated.
Oh yeah, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think the round of 8, for the most part, we gave every single game its fair shot.
Yeah.
I don't think that we were biased. We took our duties with professional journalistic merit. We really tried to be as fair as possible and as balanced as we could be. So I don't have an issue with that. In the case of Metal Gear Solid, its history up to this point has been a little bit more surprising, actually. For being such a juggernaut, Metal Gear Solid has faced some actual nail-biting competition, and I think it's like purely attributable to Arnie, actually. If you remember, in the round of 16, Metal Gear Solid went up against Banjo-Kazooie. And that episode in particular was constituted by Paul, Arnie, and Ryan Medlock, who also goes by the Video Game Bear on Instagram. And Ryan, of course, voted Banjo-Kazooie because he loves Banjo-Kazooie. And then it came down to Arnie, as Paul voted for Metal Gear Solid. And after much waffling, Arnie ultimately
broke
decided
his keyboard
in
half.
I think that he felt like the choke force powers, coming through from Skype, of Paul being like, I will choke you if you fuck this up.
Yeah. The truth is that I did not want to deny the fans this matchup ultimately, but I dream of that alternate universe where you have to sit down, you specifically, Ozzy, have to sit down to talk about Ocarina of Time and Banjo-Kazooie at the same time.
I'm so glad I wasn't part of that episode, Arnie, because I think that would have been the end of this podcast.
And Ozzy, I think you're kind of overstating my force powers there. Arnie's strategy was great. At first I was like, dude, you better not vote Banjo-Kazooie in my head. But Arnie took so long to vote that eventually I was like, dude, just vote. I don't even care anymore. Actually vote and finish the episode.
Yeah.
And so, ultimately Metal Gear Solid did advance, but in the second round, guess what it went up against? Grim Fandango.
My boy.
Which advanced, after beating down StarCraft. So, in an alternate reality, Metal Gear Solid would have gone up against StarCraft. Yeah. And what would have happened? We may never know because someone voted for Grim Fandango instead. But with respect to that particular matchup against Grim Fandango, Metal Gear Solid actually won by unanimous vote. And if you recall, that was Dennis Strillinger, also known as Trilly Vanilli, Jeff, and myself voting in favor of Metal Gear Solid advancing. So, Metal Gear Solid, you guys all know it. We've talked about it at length. Released October 21, 1998 in North America for the PlayStation Entertainment System. I think I messed that up. I don't think that's what it's actually.
It is now. That's the official name now.
But I committed to it, and as I was saying it, I was like, screw it, just go with it. Developed by Konami as an update to the Metal Gear series on the MSX computers, directed by Hideo Kojima, who we all know and love-hate, with art by Yohei Shinkawa. Critical reception of 94 Metacritic and lifetime sales of 6 million copies, at least as far as I have been able to find. In the case of Ocarina, developed by Nintendo EAD, Shigeru Miyamoto in particular, this was one of his last big projects. It took a long time to develop as well. It was a sequel to the Super Nintendo's Link to the Past. Released on November 23, 1998 in North America for the Nintendo 64. And it has a Metacritic of 99, and it sold 7.6 million copies worldwide. Let's talk about Ocarina. What were its innovations? It's a massive, massive game with an outsized influence on the genre. Mm-hmm. So let me just go over a few of the bullet points of what Ocarina of Time brought to the medium. It established 3D games and open worlds on consoles. We had 3D games, open worlds on PCs, but we had not really seen an open world like that on consoles. Everything that we had seen up to that point was much more constrained and limited. It also had day and night cycles, which we had seen before, but this game really created it in a very, seamless format where what happened at night was very different from what happened in the day. So you had that context-sensitive component. But I think its biggest innovation was the Z-axis targeting and making sure that, players could control the character in a 3D environment in a manner that you could actually target your foes and you could actually access that C dimension in a way. Mm-hmm. This is something that we're still seeing nowadays in third-person games. Resident Evil 4 and its over-the-shoulder perspective, you could clearly trace that back to Ocarina of Time. So every over-the-shoulder game at this point is traced back to the Z-axis targeting. It also had horse riding, which is not something that we had seen a lot of in console games. And ultimately, it just kind of established the rules of 3D. So, Paul, talk to me. I mean, do you think that those are fair innovations? Do you think there's anything there that I missed? What do you think particularly Ocarina of Time did well that makes it stand head and shoulders above its peers?
Did you touch on the context-sensitive button? Where one button
I didn't touch upon it, but that's
functions?
Something that it did. Yeah, it's streamlined.
That was also big. Mm-hmm. You can do so many different things with just one button, depending on where you're standing. Whereas, other developers were kind of fumbling with, okay, well, how does the player do this? And how does the player do that? And how do we assign? And Zelda was like, well, you just do it with a button. Duh.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, all the other innovations you mentioned too, it is what it is, man. Like that 3D problem, that was the big problem hanging over the whole industry at that time. We move into 3D, and how do we do this? How do we solve the camera? How do we solve targeting? How do we? And then Ocarina comes along and says, well, you do it this way, and you do it this way. And everybody's like, oh, well, then I guess all our problems are solved forever. And they were. Like, that's what happened, right? Like, it influenced every single 3D game.
Yeah, it took a while for developers to catch up. You could clearly see that Ocarina of Time was released in late 98, and you could see that games that were already in the pipeline could just couldn't implement, the innovations of Ocarina of Time. And it kind of lagged like about 2 years before games started kind of, being able to implement the innovations that Ocarina of Time had made. Mm-hmm. It was that far ahead of its time that people were just like, oh, okay, well, now we have the rules. Now we know how to do it. Mm. And Nintendo EAD made 3D look easy. Which is not something that before this we had Apocalypse by Bruce Willis, that was the kind of 3D that we were dealing with. But Jeff, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, I know that you were a PlayStation guy back in the day, but, do you think that when you saw this, you were thinking, man, these guys have figured it out?
I definitely wasn't thinking that as a 14-year-old. As a 30...
I mean, you were precocious, so, I mean, I had to
ask. I really struggle with this because I don't want to come across like a fanboy, which is what I was back then. It's a game that is so innovative in how it solved problems. I completely agree with Paul, with you guys on that. I think it did give answers to problems that clearly developers were having at the time. And that has to be absolutely lauded. Did it do other things as innovatively? No, in my opinion. I can get into those later. But I do think I have to kind of tip my hat off to it. It did some of those problem solving incredibly well, and it felt very intuitive. And I think we covered it on the review that we did, where, like Paul was saying, the single button which did all the actions. You could argue, well, you've simplified it, you've dumbed it down, because now I don't like Link doesn't jump when you want him to jump. He'll jump when it's decided that he jumps, so you don't have that freedom. Mm-hmm. But at the time, you're enjoying it so much, you don't like. Well, if I don't need to jump, I don't need to jump. I'll just jump when I need to. So it did give you those solutions, and I think everyone enjoyed it back then.
Yeah. So Arnie, I mean, do you think that these innovations have stood the test of time? Because yes, I mean, it did fix the 3D issue, but then 2 years later or 3 years later, we had games kind of adopt the second analog stick. Yeah. And really, a lot of the big issues with Ocarina of Time and 3D games around that time was the simple fact that they just didn't have a second analog stick. So Ocarina of Time had a very elegant solution with just creating the C targeting, but eventually that was superseded by the dual analog stick and the ability to control the camera through that stick. So do you think that its innovations were superseded, or do you think that the innovations are overstated in any way?
It's thank you for setting this question up for me, because this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. Is that I sort of see it there's sort of two sides to this coin, right? On the one hand, I struggle to think of a game that used the N64 controller as well and as sort of intuitively as Ocarina of Time did. But on the other hand, like I think a groundbreaking sort of advancement that Z targeting was maybe doesn't even need to exist if you don't have a controller like the N64. So on the one hand, I'm like, man, they figured it out. But on the other hand, they're the ones who created this problem for themselves in the first place. So, I feel like it was on them to figure it out. Ultimately, yes, I think that it was proven just over time that the dual analog was the superior control method, and even Nintendo eventually had to admit that yes, we need to have two analog sticks for our games. Like it works best that way. But I don't think that takes everything away from what they did. Obviously, it's a game that controls, I think, very, very well. And even I think it was good enough that even when they ported it to the 3DS, which is another system that only has one analog stick, they were still able to make that control scheme work. And I think they even improved upon it a little bit. So ultimately, Were their advancements superseded? Yes, but at the time, were they, sort of impressive? Absolutely.
So let me
I disagree here.
Okay, Go ahead, Paul.
Has anybody tried playing Dark Souls without targeting the enemy in front of them? When that dude jumps behind you and you're slowly moving the camera around, you're dead. You're dead.
Yeah.
Like, you're not gonna... That dual analog is an excellent supplement to the Z targeting. But make no mistake, the Z targeting is 100% necessary for these games.
Fair enough.
Otherwise, you're just kind of like ham-handing your camera around, and by the time you've finished putting the camera where you want it, you're dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the versatility of the Z targeting system and the precision that it brought was really its greatest advancement. It was not just the ability to control the cameras through some indirect way, but as Paul, you mentioned, you needed that precision, because before that, you needed essentially to just press a button for targeting, and you had to depend upon whatever algorithm the game was coming up with in terms of its logic in order to determine which one it would target first.
Yeah.
And that was a clusterfuck. So I do think in that sense it's something that kind of has endured over time. But Anthony, let me ask you, what are some of the dated elements of Ocarina of Time that you think have not borne out as well?
I mean, it's hard to really tell. I think so as much as I love the horseback riding, which we covered on the last episode that you weren't able to do unless you were playing winning posts at the time. I think that part is probably the most dated, which has been fixed since, but like back then it was really cool to be horseback riding from one area to another. But obviously it took forever to get from one place to another.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the main things that's obviously evolved since then in games of this magnitude, just teleporting and whatnot.
Well, let me accumulate some more haters. I've gone back to Ocarina of Time, and I did not have the benefit of playing it originally, so I played it on the 3DS. And the kind of like the one word that I would use to describe this game is like almost pastoral, because it's such a freaking slow game. Honestly, some of the things in this game, the progression is almost obtuse at times. And to be perfectly quite frank, the things that the game has me doing, when I kind of think about it, it's like I'm not having that much fun, to be quite honest. It kind of feels like I just have to figure out whatever the game wants me to do next, and it's like kind of going from one puzzle to the other that I don't particularly care for. So in a way, yes, I think that it's an adventurous experience, etc. But it never quite feels that way. It feels kind of like a small game, and I kind of see it almost similar to Tomb Raider. I mean, it did have much better 3D movement than Tomb Raider. And it's like, okay, for the time, it created a very epic experience. But to me, I just don't find myself having fun when I'm playing it. It's like the pacing of it just seems awfully slow. And the kind of moment to moment, honestly doesn't interest me that much. There's no versatility to the combat. The combat is pretty much just mash the same button over and over again, and kind of jump back, etc. But there aren't like, combos or special moves, or anything like that. And the puzzles and stuff, I mean, I could do without them. I just don't find myself having fun with Ocarina of Time. And I know that's very subjective, but I honestly feel it's a question of pacing, and I feel like the pacing of that game was deliberately slow, almost to a fault. And I find that nowadays, it's not that I need, bang, bang action, but it's just when I go back to it, I'm like, why am I doing this? Why am I putting up with this very slow intro, with this very slow, game, when it's not doing something that's, to me, thrilling me in any way. And I don't need to be thrilled at all times, but at least I need to be hooked. And the game doesn't really have a story to keep you hooked. So why would you stay in it other than because of the game mechanics, which I don't care for?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I feel about Ocarina of Time. So please send the hate mail to Arnie at Region Free Gaming Podcast. He will relay it to me so I don't have to deal with it. Well, so does anybody else feel that way?
Well, let me deflect some hate from you then, Ozzy. Let me help you out here. My biggest issue with the game is that it's boring. It's boring. I'm bored. The story is subpar. It's a rehash. They've done it before. It literally is Zelda in 3D. You're saving the princess. You're fighting.
It's threadbare. There's barely a story, Jeff.
And it's been told. And it's like, it's a very. I mean, this is all hindsight, right? Because it's going up against a game which is all story. So that's the other side. Yeah. But it felt like a huge game at the time. It felt big. But when you play it today, it's tiny and it's slow, and I completely agree. I think my problem with the combat is a counterattack combat system. You're basically waiting for the enemy to attack you to do a counterattack. It's like this is each
and fight. I've never been a fan of those types of games.
Me neither. Each fight is boring. I absolutely agree that there's no sort of like get up and go. Like Breath of the Wild is so much better from a combat system.
Yes.
I know. There's many years between them, 20 years almost between them. But Ocarina of Time, I also have the 3DS version. It is the best version to play by far. But I have to agree with Ozzy. I played it, and halfway through, I was like, I'm doing this because I think I'm supposed to, because it's Zelda.
Yeah. Same here. It didn't hook me. Like I have a tremendous amount of respect for all that it did, and yet at the same time I didn't really play it that long. It just didn't have the staying power, and I wanted to, man. I'm like, it's fucking Ocarina of Time. Like I should like this game. Everybody tells me I should like this game, and I gave it a heck of a fair shake, but it just didn't grab me, unfortunately.
It ultimately feels like one of those games you need to play rather than because you want to play it.
Yeah,
well, Arnie, you were gonna say?
No, I'm generally in agreement with you guys on this point. Like, this is why I prefer Majora's Mask to Ocarina of Time, because at least in Majora's Mask, it's not only Link's story, which is generally not very interesting to me because he doesn't talk and he doesn't really like do much of anything. But at least there's like all these side characters I can get invested with, and I think that there's not as much of that in Ocarina of Time. I think there's two things. One, I think that there's obviously some fatigue with Ocarina, because, I mean, how many times can you tell me that this is the greatest game of all time before I just tell you to shut the fuck up? And two, it's the fact that I think ultimately what Ocarina is the realization of what so many kids wanted when they played the original Legend of Zelda.
Yeah.
I think when you play that first NES game, you're like, wow, this is a gigantic world with all these things to do. Like, the only way this could be better is if it wasn't in 3D. Like, this is the thing that I want to reach for. And when Ocarina dropped, and essentially what it brought you was, here's Zelda, but in 3D, in this beautiful, I think, very well realized like world. I think pastoral is like a very nice way to describe it, in terms of like rolling hills and castles and all these environments that you get to go through. The score is excellent. Like as an experience, as a package, I think it's very well presented and it has a lot of good aspects to it. But I mean, especially when you're going up against Metal Gear, like even if Ocarina of Time had like the greatest story ever told, like the insanity that is Hideo Kojima, story-wise and character-wise, you're hard-pressed to make a bigger impression on me than that.
Yeah. Anthony, do you want to counter that in any way?
Can I jump in? Please, Ant, can I? Ant.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah.
Please. The 8-bit Zelda versus the 64-bit Zelda are so far apart. I really don't think it's a 3D realization of the original Zelda. Breath of the Wild is the 3D realization of the original Zelda. Utter freedom. Go and do what you want, wherever it is, where you want. Ocarina of Time is so scripted in a way that you feel like you're being stunted every single step of the way, because you're always thinking, well, I can't do this, so it must be something else. You end up getting frustrated because you're trying to find that thing you're meant to do. Whereas like Breath of the Wild and Zelda is no, just go out and do things how you please. So that's kind of, sorry, that's my counter. Sorry, Ant, go for it.
Yeah.
No,
Anthony, how do you feel on this point?
No, I mean, I think Nintendo did a great job of making a game for the Rare 64. But the problem is that, like we said, they had so many great innovations. And if you were to read a spec sheet and read these things, you'd be like, oh, this is awesome. This is great. But then when you start to play it, you're like, okay, is this gonna pick up? Is this gonna pick up?
Yeah.
But at the time, in that bubble of '98, this was a major thing, especially if that's all you had was a Nintendo 64. You know, like that was a major thing. It's just, this isn't something I played right away back then, but it's something I can appreciate over time and just what they tried to implement and how they did these things. But in the end, you know, I'm not playing this game again. Ever.
Yeah,
So,
when you have choices, it gets harder to stomach
Right.
Ocarina for very long. But when you're a kid and this is what you got, listen, I'm gonna go fishing as long as I can, man. Like I'm gonna.
yeah. And I think those are the big fans for Ocarina of Time. I think those are the people that they only had this game. They played it. It's the game that they cherish forever. It's the greatest game ever made. And if you were just like at least a teenager or in your 20s back then, you're looking at them like dumbass kids.
Is there any through line, I guess, from Ocarina to something like Breath of the Wild? Like, say Ocarina comes out and it's terrible and nobody likes it. Do we eventually get Breath of the Wild? Does sort of Nintendo retreat back to maybe only making 2D Zeldas?
Breath of the Wild was a complete breaking of the mold.
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild is as far away as you could get from Ocarina. It didn't have the dungeons. It didn't have the hand-holding. It's a game... It's the game that Ocarina should have been, honestly. I think Jeff put it there perfectly. I think that you could have had Breath of the Wild without Ocarina. And I don't see another Ocarina in the modern landscape, and that's not because it's a good thing. I don't say it because it's a very original experience, but more because I don't think you can pull off an Ocarina nowadays without it being, you know, labeled outdated. I mean, I that's personally how I feel.
Yeah.
So, but again, with that bashing, and I'm very, very surprised.
Are we voting now? Are we voting now?
How did this game get this far?
Let's talk about Metal Gear Solid. I mean, what did it do? It popularized the stealth genre. 98 was the breakthrough year for the stealth genre, with Thief, the Dark Project, which was also one of the contestants, and also Tenchu Stealth Assassins. But it was really Metal Gear Solid that popularized the genre in its own very particular way. But I think beyond the popularization of the stealth genre, it created a medium in which cinematic influences were very front and center. And it made the merging of cinema and games kind of come together. And in a way, the way I see it is Metal Gear Solid made games finally mature. And to me, it's kind of the Citizen Kane moment that everyone talks about. Whenever people say, when are games going to have their Citizen Kane moment? I'm like, it already happened 22 years ago. It was called Metal Gear Solid. Not only because of its writing, but because it established a baseline of what you should expect in a game. You should expect good voice acting. You should expect a very well told story, you know, where you know, you need to be mindful of plot holes, you know, and you should expect a seamless integration between narrative and gameplay. And whereas with Ocarina, it's like you have gameplay, but there's almost no story. This game was, okay, you have this gameplay, which is quite good indeed, but you also have this massive story that sticks with you throughout time. So, you know, Paul, I'm going to start with you because I know you're a big fan of Metal Gear Solid, but do you feel that I've encapsulated the innovations of Metal Gear Solid accurately?
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. It is pretty well the Citizen Kane moment for games. You know, Citizen Kane for movies, not that I was alive back then, but man, when you see what movies started out as and then what Citizen Kane brought to the table, it's virtually identical to the difference between video games and what Metal Gear did for video games. And, you know, it's not just the story. You're right. It's the stealth gameplay that, you know, it had happened before, but it didn't really have that integration with the radar on the top of the screen. The presentation was so clean. There's like no HUD in the game at all. It's just, this is the game, that's your radar, and that's it, right? There's nothing cluttering. Everything's focused on Snake. I could go on, man. It's fantastic.
I mean, and let me kind of counter a little bit, because Metal Gear Solid took a different approach to 3D, you know, whereas Zelda took the approach of, okay, let's use the Z-axis targeting. Metal Gear Solid used a fixed camera, kind of overhead approach. And it did have some issues because that overhead approach meant that you couldn't quite see beyond the camera. I mean, do you think that that's something that Metal Gear Solid should be faulted for? Let's go with you, Jeff.
I don't think so. And I think it's all about like the radar was kind of your third eye, right? That was your ability to kind of see a little bit further ahead. You could go into first person view mode and you can use your scope and what have you. So you can always see around you. I think if you were to play it today, you're going to give it to somebody to play for the first time. The first thing they would do is, right, well, why can't I move the camera? Why? What do you mean it? What do you mean it?
Yeah.
It's fixed. Okay, it moves when you hug against a wall and you look round. They're like, that's still really cool that the camera does that, and it was even cooler in Metal Gear Solid 2. But I think a modern gamer would be, as well as they'd be frustrated with maybe Zelda's battle tactics, they'd also be frustrated with the lack of fluidity that Metal Gear would have. So I think you could throw that if you compare it against its contemporaries. Against the games at the time, I think we just kind of got on with it and just kind of thought, well, all right, well, Zelda does something else, but I'm going to ignore that.
Yeah. Well, Arnie, I mean, what are some of, like, do you find that Metal Gear Solid has dated elements within it? Are there components of it that you think haven't particularly aged well beyond the fact that it has a very leery, lecherous, eye, that is kind of very uncomfortable? I mean, putting that aside, which has certainly not aged well.
Yeah.
In terms of gameplay, do you feel like it stands the test of time? Because I know you're the biggest Metal Gear skeptic here, so that's why I want to ask you.
I don't necessarily think that I'm a Metal Gear skeptic per se. I feel like the way that you guys are saying, like, Zelda feels like a game that you need to play, that's how I feel about Metal Gear Solid. Especially being on this podcast. It's a game that, obviously not having played it when I was a kid, I did have a friend who had it and I watched him play it. And then coming to it as an adult, I wouldn't necessarily say that there are aspects that are dated. I mean, I'm sure there are aspects of it that were improved in later sequels and things like that. I just think that stealth games have never gelled with me. I just think that is a particular genre that just does not work for me for some reason. And it really pains me because I want to experience the story of Metal Gear and what it has to offer, but it's such a slog for me to get through that it's really made it difficult.
Yeah. Well,
and the stealth genre, it has been improved quite a bit since Metal Gear. And I know we talked about how Ocarina has been improved and so on and so forth, but like from a moment to moment micro level gameplay, that Z targeting in Ocarina, I don't really think that has been improved very much. I mean, you have dual analog that helps your camera a bit, but it's essentially the same thing in Breath of the Wild. Like, you're targeting a character, you're zooming in on them, and it just never leaves. And that's been around now since Ocarina for 22 years, whereas Metal Gear has been improved upon in many different ways. But
you say that, Paul. I would say stealth games have been improved to a point where I can no longer play them because I could play Metal Gear because it didn't worry about what kind of breath I had or whether I'm, or whether like the light is refracting off of my suit. Like, at least Metal Gear had its rules. It got to a point now where like stealth games are bloody hard games.
Yeah,
dude, what kind of shiny ass leisure suit are you wearing in your game?
I don't know, but you know what I'm trying to say.
And let me ask Anthony. Anthony, could you find yourself going back to Metal Gear Solid, nowadays? Is it a game that you could still find yourself enjoying?
No. I mean, it's hard to go back now and play this game. It hasn't aged well at this point. But I have just such fond memories of this game when I was playing it, and it was so innovative. Everything went silent. I just couldn't hear.
No, we're just a little bit flabbergasted.
I'm shocked. I am shocked. You.
That threw me off. Everybody threw me off. My apologies. Anyway, I have such great memories of playing this game when it was released, and I have like me and my boy. he was in the hospital at the time, and we were looking at magazines, gaming magazines, and this was the game on our radar. We played it nonstop when it was released. To make a long story short, could I go back and play it now though? Probably not. It's not that the gameplay is like completely a mess, nothing, but it's just that there's been so many innovations since that it's hard to go back and play a game back in '98 the way it was meant to be played.
Yeah, let me counter that because someone has to address it. We all looked at Anthony very sternly right now.
I'm avoiding eye contact.
Yeah, let me put it this way. Every time that I pick up Metal Gear Solid, I have to keep playing it. And there aren't that many games that I do that with. It's such a perfectly tight experience. And yes, there have been further iterations, but like Jeff said, the game just kind of stands on its own. It's original and unique in its own particular way. Much like Half-Life, you're not going to get that experience anywhere else. There's only one Metal Gear Solid. And I do like, kind of like the elegance and the cleanness of its game design. To this day, I feel like the first Metal Gear Solid is Hideo Kojima's best game from a pure gameplay and game design component. I really do think that everything else that came after was just kind of shit added on top. And with this game, everything was just perfectly conceived and executed. So I find myself just completely gravitating towards this every single time that I go back to it. So, Jeff, it's your opportunity to take down Anthony.
I'm not here to do that, but I will. So, I also when I build it up, I have to play through it from start to finish. It's just a game that kind of drags me in immediately. It's got an engaging story. If I leave 3 or 4 years between plays, then the story's almost fresh again. It tells a story from start to finish. It has a great ending. Even the ending song is utterly fantastic. I have that on one of my YouTube playlists. It's an all-round media masterpiece. It has incredible voice acting, and I think voice acting has become quite an easy job to seem to get into because every game has voice acting now. But back then, your David Hayters, etc., they made it. They perfected it, in my opinion, in that generation. And like that absolutely blew me away as a 14, 15-year-old. What it didn't do, or what I don't think is quite so good when you go back to, there's a couple of boss fights that are very difficult, very finicky. You had to be very accurate with the lack of the Z targeting system. Like I think when you have to fight Vulcan Raven and he's in a tank, and you have to somehow get the grenade into the tank, and you have to hope that it lands inside the hole. There's some things that you're like, this is quite painful. And I think at the time, I'm sure I would have had to have done some of those boss fights at least 4 or 5 times before I got them right. And it wasn't because I was bad; it was because they're just not quite so solid in terms of the gameplay. I think, like you mentioned, some of the kind of the masculine aspects of the game, and obviously Snake is a lot of James Bond in his character. Does what he wants. He kind of he kind of tries to get on side of every woman that he comes across, falls in love very quickly. He's one of those types of characters. Growing up with James Bond, with Roger Moore and Connery, that was something at the time that I was just like, well, yeah, but that's what spies do, doesn't it? Spies just kind of always have a way with words and always seem to get the women. So I think as a male,
they shag the ladies
with that. They shag them. That was very Austin Powers, wasn't it? So I very much agree with that part of it hasn't aged so well on there, but it is of its time, and I don't think I'm ever going to take that away from that game. It's just it is what it was. In terms of the experience, I think Metal Gear Solid, if you want that experience, you have to go play that game. Just like with Half-Life, you've got to go to Metal Gear Solid. You can't get it from another game. It only gets more confusing, let's be honest, when you play the other Metal Gear Solid. It just becomes an utter mess.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I mentioned how well, or Paul said, look how good the stealth mechanics came, how they came along, and look how the story progressed. And I'm like, yeah, great. But actually, me being a bit of a simpleton, I prefer Metal Gear Solid because I understood what was going on. You even mentioned it earlier on, Ozzy. The codecs aren't overly long. They're not overwinded. Some of them are a little bit like, come on, where are we getting to here? But they all serve the purpose.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought that was, everything was leading towards one thing. It wasn't trying to go in all different directions, which the later games do. So they knew what they wanted to tell. They had all their little references to previous Kojima games, which was great. Otacon was the geek, and it was all very Japanese in that way. So, there's a lot of things to enjoy. And like the variance in level design as well, how you would go, if you would, I think right at the end, you had to go from one end to the other, and you realized I can go through this whole level, this whole game, like non-stop. It was fantastic. So there were all these little things that you really feel like you're in this world, and it's very tight, and it's not like the Zelda, which is like, well, where do I go next? Metal Gear was driving you towards something, and you're like, you know what, I want to get to Liquid, I want to beat him because I want to stop the nukes. And then all the stuff happens. So that's my personal, this game had something.
Yep. All right. So that's a very, very spirited defense. So I guess we can now go into the decision. Ooh. I think we can actually make the decision now. So I'm gonna buck the trend and actually start with you, Arnie.
All right. Ultimately, both of these games are gigantic. I think that there is a reason both of these games are so fondly remembered. I think there's a reason that we expected to be here at some point, despite all the other amazing games that were on this bracket and in this tournament. Ultimately, for me, I think it comes down to, because I see them both as such works of their time, and I don't have a particular attachment to one or the other, it ultimately comes down to which one I think I'd rather play, if I were to sit down and do it now. And in that sense, I do think it'd be Ocarina of Time. I think the biggest thing that Metal Gear Solid has going for it, in my opinion, is the story and it's the characters. But I think that the way I see Metal Gear Solid is more of this is the gate that is keeping me from sort of opening up the rest of this narrative that I really want to get into. Whereas Ocarina of Time, I can just sit down, play for a little bit, enjoy it, get frustrated, put it down, come back to it. So my vote is going to be Ocarina of Time.
Good. Okay, Anthony.
Both these games are not games I'm going to play now. I'm just not going to go back and play these games. With that being said, though, my vote goes for Metal Gear. For the one fact that, I can never get that boss battle with Psycho Mantis out of my head. That was one of the most amazing video game moments of my life. And I had to find out, I think, reading through a gaming magazine to be like, oh, shit, that's what I needed to do, So, but both these games, like I said, man, they were great for the time. But to me, Metal Gear was just I could not put this game down. It had everything I wanted in a video game. And like you guys mentioned earlier, it was for the mature video game audience, and to me, it's Metal Gear.
All right. So, Paul?
Yeah, man, it's a tough one, right? This is kind of the matchup we've all been waiting for, so to speak. And I just can't discount how thoroughly and completely Ocarina solved that third dimension. It's unbelievable when you think about it, just how much everybody else was struggling with it. And this was it. This was the last frontier. Aside from maybe VR, that problem. A problem of that magnitude, I don't think is ever going to present itself to us again in this medium, right? That third dimension, that was the last thing. And the way Ocarina took that third dimension and completely squashed it and just nailed it that first time out is absolutely remarkable. On the other hand, which one would I rather play today? No question, it's Metal Gear, right? Ocarina didn't grab me. Metal Gear solved its own set of problems. It kind of created its own subgenre for good or bad. I can see why people dislike stealth games. Don't get me wrong. But, like I said, Metal Gear solved its own problems. It presented a level of presentation that would become the standard bearer. If your game didn't sound as good as Metal Gear, nobody wanted to play it. If the voice acting sucked, people would go back to Snake, and rightfully they should. So, For as great as Ocarina was in solving so many problems presented by this new dimension in video gaming that we'll never see again, I still have to vote Metal Gear. It's just faster, it's tighter, and it's more memorable. Like, to this day, man, that first time that I beat Metal Gear Solid and I saw the ending, and my jaw had never hit the floor so hard and been left there for so long as it was after the ending to that game. It's a masterpiece.
All right, that's great to hear. So that's 2-1. Jeff, give us your vote, buddy.
So I think it's probably quite obvious the way I've been speaking. I feel that both games. No, really, no. Both. I can just see right now all the American Nintendo fans who only played Ocarina of Time and have been brainwashed to believe that it's the best game ever are just screaming at us right now. No. Ocarina of Time was a game that I was jealous that friends had that I couldn't play. I was jealous when I played it round their house. I was like, I don't want to go home and not have this to play. This looks amazing. I want to see what happens next. Once I did play it, I was like, oh, really? Okay, well, maybe I wasn't missing what I thought. Therefore, I'm voting for Metal Gear Solid.
Nice. So that means Metal Gear Solid advances. Yep.
Oh,
so that you were going to say, Jeff?
I was just like, oh dear, oh god.
Yeah. We're ready for the hate. It's coming.
Our whole North American market is gone.
So I've been taking the cowardly route and just being the last to vote after it's already been decided, but I don't think that there was any question as to how I was going to vote. Look, there's only one Metal Gear Solid. There's just, it's an unparalleled experience. I don't think that we have ever seen such a tight game in terms of its concept and execution. There are a few, I would say Bloodborne, for example, but it kind of, it's its own gem. I mean, I think it should go up on the Smithsonian. I think it should be, it should be an artifact for humanity. Like it's a world treasure, I think, honestly. If I had to be on a deserted island and I could only take one game, it would be this. And if I was asked, which game out of all games would best represent, what games could do, I would put Metal Gear Solid there. Ocarina of Time probably gets very close to that, not for me, but I think for a lot of people. But I honestly don't find myself having any type of interest in Ocarina. And that's not, I think, a personal preference. I just think it's a very slowly paced game. And for me, Metal Gear Solid, it's perfect in every way. There are issues with the boss fights, etc. And, stealth is not for everyone and the enemies are a little bit dumb, but it has its own rules and you play by them, and those rules still tend to stand the test of time, even though we've found other ways to address, those particular situations. And so I can always go back to it. And so I think it's timeless. I honestly think it's a timeless game. And I don't see how this game 20 years from now, we're not going to be talking about that. I think we're still going to be talking about Metal Gear Solid just the way that we talk about Pac-Man. So yeah, it has to be Metal Gear Solid. So that's it. It's 4-1, and so our final matchup is set. It's going to be Half-Life against Metal Gear Solid. So anybody want to pour one out for Ocarina of Time?
Just riding off into the foggy sunset.
So that's it, guys. That's been the semifinals. This has been a very interesting, exciting experiment. I've honestly had a ton of fun doing this, and I hope likewise, you guys have had as much fun as I have. And hopefully your listeners are having fun with us. Those that are not completely screaming and being taken to an ER because they just popped, several blood vessels. But that's it. That's our decision. This is our subjective opinions. Yep. And with that out of the way, we're going to say goodbye. You can find us online. We are the Region Free Gamers. You can hit us up on Instagram. That's usually where we can be found, where Arnie's manning the Instagram. That's Region Free Gamers Podcast. So that's where we, started. That's where we grew out of. So that's kind of, where you can find us. You can also find us at our website, regionfreegamers.com. You can contact us via old-fashioned email. You can also find us on Twitter. That's Region Free Gamer without the S. You can find all of us on Instagram in our own personal pages, which we don't have to go over. But again, if you like what you're hearing, make sure to go over to iTunes and leave us a review. It really makes our day, and it really helps us grow. And also hit the subscribe button. And if you know anybody else that would be interested in listening to us rant and piss people off, let them know. Maybe they can be pissed off as well. That's been it. This has been the semifinals, guys. Bust out your vuvuzelas. We are going to the finals, guys. And the finals is set. Half-Life versus Metal Gear Solid. Let's get it on.